When the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center began to climb above the streets of Lower Manhattan, people claimed that they would stand for 1,000 years, but only a quarter of a century later, these magnificent symbols of man's creation were left seething in peril, as one of the most evil acts in history laid waste to these gigantic skyscrapers, when 19 terrorists in 2 hijacked airliners broke through the perceived safety of our Western world, and in so doing made victims of us all. However, while most remember them for their death, there was also a life to the Twin Towers, one that, though initially maligned because of their seemingly inhuman size, helped to save New York from economic stagnation, and would come to be icons of not only New York, but the capitalist way, their place in history immortalized in film, TV, books, and other media, as what were once the epitome of America, their very image still able to evoke a response even 20 years after their destruction. The World Trade Center, as a concept, began during the 1940s, when the primary incomes of New York City began to shift from an economy based largely around shipping to a center for corporations and financial firms, compounded further by the development of the shipping container, which saw the previous use of boxes and crates that were transferred via traditional inner-city harbor facilities, instead being routed through dedicated container terminals. In terms of growth, the widespread development of financial centers in Midtown Manhattan began following a spike in property prices in the historic city of Lower Manhattan, with developers opting to build office spaces on cheap land that was, at the time, home to low-level tenement housing and family-run businesses, with the siting of the Empire State Building, Chrysler Building, and Rockefeller Center in Midtown, essentially turning what was once the suburbs into an all-new city center within the space of a decade. In a fashion similar to the Rockefeller Center, the new World Trade Center project of 1946 would include 21 buildings over a 10-block area at an estimated cost of $150 million, but demand for the scheme was nowhere near enough to justify, and could only break even if it received the backing of 4,800 of America's 6,000 largest corporations, forcing the project to be put on hold less than a year after its conception, while the World Trade Corporation, established by the New York State Legislature and managed by New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey, was dissolved in 1949. The World Trade Center project was mooted again in 1954, when developer William Zeckendorf, who had purchased the air rights to New York's Pennsylvania Station from the Pennsylvania Railroad, suggested the center be built on what was then the grand though forlorn station building, but this never went beyond the drawing board and was cancelled in 1955. While Midtown Manhattan saw massive expansion during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, the historic center of New York, Lower Manhattan, was left largely out of the wider economic boom, and while it was still the home of the city's financial district, little was done to improve the seriously outdated infrastructure and architecture of the area, worsened by the migration of affluent residents to the suburbs following the mass introduction of freeways. With the collapse of the shipping industry for both passengers and cargo, as airlines sped up international journey times, Lower Manhattan became a dirty, dangerous, and generally unpleasant place to live and work by the end of the 1950s, and thus chairman of the Chase Manhattan Corporation, David Rockefeller, chose to begin a major urban renewal scheme, starting with the construction of his new corporate headquarters at 1 Chase Manhattan Plaza in 1961, a skyscraper that combined an international style of architecture with a spacious open-air plaza at its base to help provide recreational areas. While few tenants, apart from his own company, moved into 1 Chase Manhattan Plaza, Rockefeller was undaunted, and by 1958 he established the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association, or DLMA, which commissioned architectural firm Skidmore, Owings & Merrill to draw up plans for revitalizing the district, their first scheme being to revive the dormant World Trade Center project, their initial plan to have the site built on a 13-acre plot located on the shores of the East River, atop what is now the South Street Historic Seaport, but was then a largely redundant harbor area that comprised empty wharves and dockyard buildings that dated back to the mid-1800s. The original World Trade Center proposal intended to replace the former dockyard with a complex of buildings that included a 900-foot-long exhibition hall, a 50 to 70-story building with a hotel located on some of its upper floors, and a series of other amenities, consisting of a theater, shops, and restaurants, as well as a new Securities Exchange building, which the DLMA hoped would house the New York Stock Exchange, the main goal of the center being to marry functional office and trading space with recreation and leisure facilities, something that was sorely lacking in Lower Manhattan at the time. Supported by his brother, Nelson Rockefeller, David turned to the director of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, Austin J. Tobin, to investigate the feasibility of building the World Trade Center on the East River side of Lower Manhattan, and after publishing the results of the Port Authority's study in March 1961, Tobin confirmed that the site would be ideal, despite objections from locals, but in order to deliver the project, both the state governments of New York and New Jersey had to be consulted, and although New York was supportive of the plan, New Jersey Governor Robert B. Meyner voiced severe objections to the proposal, citing the fact that New York was being allowed a $355 million building project while New Jersey was being left to stagnate. Particular concern by Meyner was drawn to the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad, an underground railway system that had opened in 1908 and was extended from New Jersey to Lower Manhattan via the downtown tubes a year later, with the Hudson and Manhattan terminating at the specially built Hudson Terminal on the west side of the island, among the largest train stations by physical size in America, and consisting of an underground concourse that, mirroring the later Twin Towers, stood beneath two identical 22-story office blocks connected to each other by a pedestrian bridge. By 1958, ridership on the railroad had declined to 26 million passengers per year against a peak ridership of 113 million in 1927, this being caused by the construction of road connections such as the Holland and Lincoln tunnels under the Hudson, and the decrepit condition of the rolling stock stations and infrastructure. And with this being the only sustainable transport alternative across the Hudson, having replaced the ferry services in 1920, it was imperative for the state governments and the Port Authority to maintain the upkeep of the railroad, it now providing the New Jersey government with the perfect bargaining chip on which the World Trade Center project hinged, Meyner suggesting his support for the project in exchange for the Port Authority buying and operating the Hudson and Manhattan. Initially, the exchange went poorly, with Rockefeller introducing a bill that would combine the $70 million purchase of the Hudson and Manhattan with the $335 million behind the World Trade Center, but the rushed bill was quickly highlighted by analysts to have price disparities between the two agreements, thus causing negotiations with Meyner to stall, even though the bill had been approved by the New York State Legislature in February 1961. A few months later, Port Authority aide Sidney Skakter submitted his own independent report as to the potential of moving the World Trade Center site from the East River to the Hudson, choosing instead 16 acres of Lower Manhattan, which included both the Hudson Terminal and a small collection of low buildings and businesses that dated back to the early 1920s called Radio Row, a neighborhood that derived its name from the many shops that specialized in selling and repairing radio sets as well as other electrical goods. By 1960, though, Radio Row was in severe decline, having become crime-ridden and largely occupied by junk dealers and cut-price scrap merchants. Therefore, Skakter proposed a fundamental replacement of the entire Hudson Terminal site with new office buildings and a modern underground terminus, followed in December 1961 by Tobin conducting several meetings with then newly elected New Jersey Governor Richard J. Hughes regarding the purchase of the Hudson and Manhattan and the movement of the World Trade Center to the terminal site. In purchasing the Hudson and Manhattan, the Port Authority would also own the Hudson Terminal and the unused air rights above, and thus, on January 22, 1962, the New York and New Jersey state governments formally agreed both the purchase of the Hudson and Manhattan by the Port Authority and the development of the World Trade Center, with the Hudson and Manhattan being subsequently renamed to the Port Authority Trans-Hudson Line, or PATH, while Tobin formed the World Trade Office at the Port Authority to help develop the project under the leadership of Guy F. Tozzoli. The site chosen for the construction of the World Trade Center consisted of a 16-acre trapezoidal-shaped plot occupying 12 city blocks, being bounded by Vesey, Church, Liberty, and West Streets to the north, east, south, and west, respectively, while the existing intersecting streets would be removed and replaced with a superblock area that could be used for recreation away from the traffic. In order to accomplish this, 323 commercial or industrial tenants, between 15,000 and 30,000 employees, over 1,000 offices, and approximately 100 residents would have to be evicted, resulting in protests being led against the Port Authority and the state of New York for what was perceived to be the smothering of individual businesses by the unstoppable corporate machine. In response, the Port Authority set up an office to handle tenant complaints and assist in their relocation, the Port Authority preferring to deal more with individual tenants rather than large groups of merchants in order to convince them to move. But in June 1962, a group representing approximately 325 shops and 1,000 other affected small businesses filed an injunction challenging the Port Authority's power of eminent domain or the takeover of private property for public use, this legal battle continuing for months as the lower courts refused to support the cause of both the merchants and the World Trade Center, while the New York Court of Appeals ruled against the World Trade Center in February 1963, citing that the project served no public purpose and threatened the merchants of Radio Row, nullifying the Port Authority's land acquisition. When the merchants turned to the United States Supreme Court, it ruled on November 12, 1963, that their case lacked proof of needing federal action, and despite many businesses feeling that the compensation was inadequate, the eminent domain prevailed, and the few remaining tenants were coaxed into accepting the Port Authority's payout of $30,000 for any businesses currently sited in the demolition zone, but this ultimately led to many small firms struggling to recover or never reopening. With the project having received approval from both the New York and New Jersey state governments, the Port Authority set about looking for major tenants who would invest in the scheme, but due to there being little corporate incentive to occupy this site, the Port Authority was forced to seek assistance from government agencies, including the United States Customs Service and the New York state government, these being guaranteed a place at the World Trade Center in January 1964. Although commercial occupiers did sign up, they were not enough to make the scheme economically viable, and therefore Tobin and Tozzoli decided that, in order to increase the project's appeal, the World Trade Center would be built to a scale that far exceeded anything that had been built before, replacing the original floor space of 5 to 6 million square feet to a site with nearly 10 million square feet, equivalent to that of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. In order to accommodate 10 million square feet of office space into a 16-acre site, architects struggled to meet the Port Authority's stringent demands, with the first 3 designers dismissed due to a lack of creative alternatives to the problem, until eventually Tozzoli was introduced to a Japanese-American architect from Seattle named Minoru Yamasaki, who had previously worked on several large-scale office and residential projects, his most notable creations being the gigantic but ill-conceived Pruitt-Igoe housing project in St. Louis, which was strangled by the stringent demands and constraints of the local government, and the 30-story 1 Woodward Avenue Tower in Detroit, built in 1962. Despite Yamasaki believing he was the wrong man for the job, he had soon developed, in conjunction with Emery Roth & Sons, as the associate architectural firm, a unique design that was both unmistakable and bold, his vision being a pair of twin towers that would rise to 80 stories, but this proposal fell short of the Port Authority's 10 million square foot floor space requirement by 2 million square feet, while considerations for a complex of 4 towers, as well as a large central tower with 10 low-level supporting buildings, also struggled to pass muster, Yamasaki being hesitant to design a building higher than 80 floors, due to the requirement to fit a suitable number of elevator shafts within the structure that would efficiently ferry workers to and from their floors. At the time, while it was possible to build skyscrapers beyond 80 floors in height, established elevator technology meant that in order to provide direct access to higher floors, more elevator shafts would be required, which in turn took up large swathes of the extensive floor space the World Trade Center project was banking on to attract clients, though this issue was eventually overcome through the adoption of a strategy similar to that of the New York subway, and one that had been previously used in the John Hancock Center in Chicago, where a series of express and local elevators would begin and terminate at sky lobbies located partway up the tower. The idea was to have local elevators stopping at every floor between sky lobbies, while express elevators for higher floors would skip multiple floors to provide speedy access, allowing for multiple elevators that could be stacked within the same shaft without taking up much needed floor space, the final locations for the sky lobbies being positioned on the 44th and 78th floors of each tower, while initial floor space predictions were increased from 62% to 75% as fewer elevators occupied the interior. In total, the World Trade Center hosted 99 elevators per tower, allowing the Twin Towers to reach 110 stories without sacrificing floor space, thereby making them the tallest buildings in the world, regardless of the fact that this wasn't the original intention of the project, Yamasaki unveiling on January 18, 1964, an 8-foot model of his proposed complex, calling for a plaza area consisting of 6 structures, with the focal point being the 2 110-story skyscrapers that would be approximately 207 feet wide and 1,360 feet high. The Twin Towers would feature many external quirks, most notably the narrow 18-inch windows, these fixtures reflecting Yamasaki's own fear of heights, and thus being used to provide a sense of security to the occupants. The effect being that while the windows only occupied 30% of the building's exterior, thus causing the towers to appear like 2 slabs against the lower Manhattan skyline, the facades were clad in an aluminium alloy so as to make the structures less faceless, as well as giving a translucent effect during different times of the day. In terms of fundamental design principles, the Twin Towers were built using the framed tube concept that had been introduced by Bangladeshi-American structural engineer Fazlur Rahman Khan, which replaced the previous system of having loads distributed through dozens of columns across the floor, with a new system wherein high-strength load-bearing perimeter steel columns, that were lightweight but tightly packed together, were combined with prefabricated floor trusses that connected them with the central core of the building, allowing for rigid column-free floor space that formed a self-supporting structure. Therefore, the Twin Towers were comprised of 59 perimeter columns per facade, separated by 18-inch windows that were connected to the 87-foot by 135-foot core, which itself comprised 47 steel columns running from bedrock to the top of each tower, while also housing elevator banks, stairwells, and service areas, by floor trusses that had a span of 60 foot in the long span areas and 35 foot in the short span area, each section of the perimeter structure being built as prefabricated modular pieces that consisted of 3 columns 3 stories tall that were connected by spandrel plates. This building method formed the main body of the Twin Towers, and required 40% less structural steel than conventional building designs to accomplish, the only variations within the buildings being from the 7th floor to the ground level and down to the foundation, wherein the perimeter columns were spaced 10 feet apart to accommodate doorways, while on the 107th floor of each tower, 10 hat trusses or outrigger trusses, 6 along the long axis of the core and 4 along the short axis, connected the core to the perimeter walls, thereby allowing the redistribution of loads between the core and the walls, and by extension giving rise to the possibility of supporting a radio transmission tower, with both Twin Towers having been built with the potential to host an antenna mast as part of a compromise between the Port Authority and local radio and TV stations, who feared the gigantic skyscrapers would block reception. One issue the flat-fronted, lightweight Twin Towers faced was the problem of sway, with the structures capable of being pushed up to a foot off center on the highest floors, thus resulting in experiments being undertaken to consider the tolerances of occupants, with test subjects being recruited through the deceptive prospect of a free eye exam, when in reality they were being subject to simulated building sway, many of the people involved responding poorly, as they experienced dizziness and other symptoms akin to those of seasickness. And while the use of viscoelastic dampers fitted at joints between floor trusses and perimeter columns helped reduce this phenomenon, the issue of sway was never fully overcome, illustrated by loose blinds and drapes tapping against the windows, drafts rushing up the elevator shafts and stairwells, and more sensitive workers feeling ill enough to require a leave of absence. One of the more concerning subjects relating to the construction of the Twin Towers was the event of a commercial airliner accidentally crashing into one of the buildings, New York having been no stranger to such accidents, as in July 1945, a B-25 bomber that was lost in the fog on its way to Newark Airport crashed into the 78th and 79th floors of the Empire State Building, killing all 3 crew and 11 occupants in the tower, while in May 1946, a Beechcraft C-45F Expediter, also lost in the fog while on its way to Newark Airport, struck the 58th floor of the 40 Wall Street Tower in Lower Manhattan, killing all 5 aboard. As such, when designing the World Trade Center, the possibility of a commercial airliner, namely a Boeing 707, crashing into either one of the towers at low speed while on approach to one of the airports was factored, estimating that any aircraft lost in the fog during the approach pattern would likely be traveling at anywhere between 160 and 250 knots, as was the case with Aerolíneas Argentinas Flight 342 on February 20, 1981, a Boeing 707, on approach to New York JFK, which had descended too early to 1,500 feet during foggy conditions and was set to crash into the North Tower. But fortunately, through the intervention of Air Traffic Controller Donald Zimmerman, he saw that a collision was impending on his radar screen and ordered the airliner to climb to 3,000 feet, narrowly avoiding impact with the tower. In the event a fire did start inside the World Trade Center, sprayed fire-resistant materials, or SFRMs, were used to protect some structural steel elements, including all floor trusses and beams, while gypsum wallboard was used to protect core columns, and vermiculite plaster was used in combination with SFRMs on the perimeter columns. These fire protection measures according with the 1968 New York City building codes, which were surprisingly more lenient than the requirements of older building codes, the most notable being the demand for only 3 escape stairwells, while older codes required a minimum of 6. Furthermore, 1968 building codes did not require sprinklers for high-rise buildings, with the exception of underground spaces, and therefore sprinklers were only installed in the underground parking garage and subway stations of the complex, while other forms of fire protection and insulation were through the use of asbestos, but this was only partially implemented before the New York City Department of Air Resources ordered contractors building the World Trade Center to stop using this material in April 1970 under Section 112 of the Clean Air Act of that year, in which asbestos became one of the first hazardous pollutants to be regulated under the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, but by this time the Twin Towers were nearly completed. Outside of the Twin Towers themselves, the remainder of the World Trade Center complex would consist of 4 low-level buildings surrounding a wide plaza, the overarching theme of the complex being of an Arabesque origin, Arabic traits obvious in the facades of the Twin Towers themselves, while the plaza area with its central fountain took much of its inspiration from the Great Mosque of Mecca, the intention of Yamasaki being to create a haven of peace in the whirling congestion of downtown Manhattan, the plaza being filled with flowers, benches and sculptures to give the area a humane and pleasant feel. With the final design having been settled upon, and with the state governments of New York and New Jersey now able to come to an agreement on the siting of the complex, the New York City Hall only found out about the move of the proposed site to the west side of Lower Manhattan in an article published in the Newark Evening News. New York Mayor Robert F. Wagner, Jr., angered that the Port Authority had gone over his head, demanded that the final accord on the siting of the World Trade Center be delayed until his own agreement had been included, and although City Hall was only responsible for the streets that intersected the proposed site, not the real estate lining them, Wagner sided with the tenants of Radio Row to oppose the condemnation of their properties. In 1965, Wagner decided not to run for a fourth term as mayor of New York, and was replaced by Republican John Lindsay during that year's election. The New York mayor, together with the New York City Council, raising concerns about the limited extent that the Port Authority had involved the city during the negotiations and deliberations surrounding the World Trade Center, specifically around tax issues, as the Port Authority offered to pay the city an extra $4 million per year in exchange for foregoing tax payments, while the city wanted 4 times the amount the Port Authority was offering. Eventually, after over 2 years of negotiation between the Port Authority and the City of New York, an agreement was finally reached on August 3, 1966, in which the Port Authority would make annual payments to the city, in lieu of taxes, for the portion of the World Trade Center leased to private tenants, while the Port Authority would also deliver the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, these payments subsequently rising in line with the real estate tax rate, while the project would be financed through tax-exempt bonds issued by the Port Authority. But even before this agreement had been finalized, demolition work on Radio Row had begun as early as March 1965, and by the summer of 1966, most of the land had been cleared, with groundbreaking being undertaken on August 5th of that year. The construction of the 110-story Twin Towers, based on their location, presented a variety of engineering challenges, most notably the lack of a solid foundation, the World Trade Center being erected on reclaimed land, with only half the site, beneath what would become Buildings 4 and 5, situated on the original outline of Manhattan Island, thus meaning that conventional skyscraper construction techniques could not guarantee a stable foundation for the structures. With bedrock located 65 feet below ground, designers conceived the bathtub, a concrete slurry wall that would surround the foundations of the 2 towers and essentially act as a proxy for bedrock, the creation of the structure requiring the digging of an oblong trench filled with a slurry mixture composed of bentonite, before a steel cage was inserted and concrete was poured in, forcing the slurry out, the entire process taking around 14 months. As excavation of the remainder of the site began, the matter of maintaining the operation of the path service became apparent. This problem alleviated thanks to the suspension of the original Hudson tubes on specialized trestles that made the path an elevated railway, until a brand new station at the World Trade Center was built and opened in 1971. The North Tower rose first in August 1968, followed 6 months later by the South Tower in January 1969, the steel for the buildings being provided through a $74 million contract awarded to the Pacific Car and Foundry Company, the LaSled Steel Company, Granite City Steel Company, and Carl Koch Erecting Company, the use of multiple steel suppliers by the Port Authority being done as a cost-saving measure, while erection of the structures was contracted to Carl Koch, and creation of the aluminium facades was done by the Aluminum Company of America. Managed by the Tishman Realty and Construction Company, building the World Trade Center was done through a conveyor belt process of prefabricated parts, shipped in from each supplier by train to the Penn Central's yard in Jersey City, before being transported by a fleet of flatbed trucks through the Holland Tunnel to the construction site, then lifted into place by crane, while parts which couldn't fit through the tunnel were brought across the Hudson on barges hauled by tugboats. Efficiency and quality control were paramount, and with the project already running years behind schedule, a new method of quickly erecting the towers had to be adopted, this coming in the form of the Favco Standard 2700 crane, manufactured by Favell Mort Limited of New South Wales, Australia, and affectionately dubbed the Kangaroo crane, a construction rig that was designed to use hydraulics to lift components and provide its own power to rise with each additional floor, essentially jumping from floor to floor as the building rose. Unfortunately, construction of the World Trade Center wasn't without its flaws, the most notable being a tugboat strike in 1970 that disrupted the shipment of larger pieces to the site, and a proposal was therefore made to hire a Sikorsky S-64 Sky Crane to lift these structural elements to the center, but this delivery method was axed after its first run when the helicopter lost its load of steel over the Kill Van Kull Strait. Other mishaps included a propane tank explosion on March 16, 1970, injuring 6 workers, the site being invaded by throngs of protesters opposed to the Vietnam War in April of the same year, starting a massive brawl between themselves and the construction workers, and the severance of all phone service in Lower Manhattan when a pile driver accidentally crushed telephone cables, while during the course of the construction process, 60 workers tragically lost their lives through a variety of accidents, the most common being due to falling from the higher floors. Finally, after over 10 years of planning and development, the North Tower of the World Trade Center was topped out at 1,368 feet on December 23, 1970, dethroning the Empire State Building as the world's tallest after a 39-year reign, followed on July 19, 1971 by the topping out of the South Tower at 1,362 feet, the first tenants being allowed to move into the completed sections of the North Tower from December 15, 1970, followed by the South Tower in January 1972. Both towers were formally dedicated on April 4, 1973, while other initial aspects of the World Trade Center complex included Buildings 4, 5, and 6, a series of 8 to 9-story satellite buildings designed by Yamasaki and Emery Roth & Sons that were completed between 1973 and 1975, Building 4 going on to have the distinction of hosting the largest trading floor in the world, while Building 6 became the new home of the U.S. Customs Service. On the plaza itself, Yamasaki's original concept for building an open space between the towers culminated in a massive public area, 21,500 meters square in size, the largest in New York, at the center of which was a round fountain sat beneath the Sphere, a 25-foot-high sculpture cast in 52 bronze segments, the Port Authority having commissioned German artist Fritz Koenig to create the piece in 1966, who delivered it to the site 5 years later as a symbol of peace and world trade, the sculpture being able to do a full rotation every 24 hours thanks to a mechanism built within its base. Beneath the plaza, a gigantic shopping concourse was constructed known as the Mall of the World Trade Center, which housed approximately 100 stores and was the largest indoor shopping center in Manhattan, the management of which was outsourced to the Westfield Group of Australia, the mall being connected by a bank of 7 escalators to the PATH station below, which opened on July 6, 1971, and replaced the original Hudson Terminal by moving it further west, while expanding the radius of the approach loops in order to accommodate 10-car trains, the terminus hosting 5 platforms, while also being the first subway station in America to be air-conditioned, which, in combination with new trains built by the St. Louis Car Company, meant it could handle 85,000 passengers daily, an attractive public transport alternative to the often congested Holland Tunnel. Power for the World Trade Center complex came from a series of generators located in the lowest basement level, each of these massive machines capable of providing electricity for a small city, while in order to avoid the use of unsightly air conditioning units on the roofs of the Twin Towers, water was pumped in from the Hudson River and cooled before being ventilated up inside the buildings. Each of the towers had 43,600 windows that were cleaned using a unique window washer rig designed to be both functional and safe for its operators, the window washer being housed in a small shed located on the roof of each tower, while using a series of tracks and turntables to run along each side of the building, the trolley itself being attached to the side of the building by a set of runners engraved in the perimeter columns, and was capable of descending the 110-floor journey in around half an hour, with the average time taken to clean one side of each tower taking a week, and a month to do the entire building, this cycle repeating continuously between March and October, with no washing taking place during the winter due to the risk of water freezing and falling as heavy clumps of ice to the streets below. In all, construction of the World Trade Center required the excavation of 1.2 million cubic yards of material, and while normal practice would have seen this landfill shipped out to sea and deposited on the ocean floor, the Port Authority chose instead to use it as part of a massive land reclamation project on the opposite side of West Street, with the redundant Piers 7 to 11, adjacent to the World Trade Center, being demolished in February 1967 and excavated material poured directly into the Hudson to create Battery Park City, extending Manhattan by a further 700 feet into the river along a 6-block length, and is now home to what was formerly the World Financial Center complex of office towers. Regardless of its many features, as well as being the tallest buildings in the world, the Twin Towers were lambasted upon their completion, with criticism aimed at the use of the superblock on which the site was built, severing numerous historic streets and replacing the traditional dense neighborhood, while the Twin Towers themselves were derided for their simple but excessive design, the 2 boxy skyscrapers towering above the traditional Art Deco skyline of Lower Manhattan being seen as an act of heresy in the eyes of the architectural elite, a celebration of excessive capitalism at the expense of aesthetic meaning. In May 1973, the North Tower of the World Trade Center lost its title as the world's tallest building after only 2.5 years, following the topping out of the Sears Tower in Chicago at 1,450 feet. But while its Midwestern rival was structurally taller, the World Trade Center would retain the title of having the highest number of habitable floors in a skyscraper until the completion of the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, which opened in 2010. The perception of the World Trade Center was further brought into doubt by the release of 1974's The Towering Inferno, the production of which, as well as the two novels that formed the basis of the movie, being inspired by the short-lived skyscraper building spree of the late 1960s and early 1970s, the film centering around the fictional 135-story glass tower in San Francisco as it is overcome by a fire caused through faulty, cheaply laid wiring, resulting in the entire building being devastated by flames, the overall message of the movie being to highlight the inherent difficulty for firefighters to tackle blazes in skyscrapers, the World Trade Center being the most prominent example. A year later, on February 13, 1975, life imitated art when a 3-alarm fire broke out on the 11th floor of the North Tower, spreading to the 9th and 14th floors by igniting telephone cable insulation routed through a utility shaft that ran vertically between the floors. And while the fires on the 9th, 12th, 13th and 14th floors were extinguished quickly, the blaze on the 11th floor was harder to tackle, being fueled by cabinets filled with paper, alcohol-based fluid for office machines, and other office equipment. And though fireproofing protected the steel elements of the tower, water used to extinguish the blaze flooded several floors below, and it was only after this incident that the Port Authority decided that they would retrofit the twin towers with sprinkler systems. Although it seemed that the World Trade Center was a largely detested building complex that had been forced upon the people of New York, not everyone viewed the buildings in a dim light, with some architectural critics praising the engineering behind the towers, while noting both the technical innovation and functionality of the buildings, providing an unprecedented amount of floor space across the twin towers and its surrounding complex of lower buildings. One French acrobat took his admiration for the buildings one step further when, on August 7, 1974, Philippe Petit and his band of conspirators strung a wire across the 200-foot chasm between the two buildings, and, at around 7 a.m., stepped out into the void 1,360 feet above the streets of New York, enthralling commuters on their way to work for 45 minutes as he taunted the dozens of police officers who had accumulated on both buildings to apprehend him. Eventually, poor weather forced him to return to the towers, whereupon he was promptly arrested, but having completed the artistic crime of the century, Petit had achieved the world record for highest high-wire act ever performed, a record that wouldn't be broken until March 2015, when Freddie Nock walked across the chasm between the two Swiss mountains of Biancorat and Piz Privelus at a height of 11,587 feet, and despite charges of trespass and criminal recklessness being brought against him, the district attorney dropped all formal charges in exchange for a free aerial show for children in Central Park above Belvedere Lake, now known as Turtle Pond, while also being given a lifetime pass to visit the observation deck of the South Tower. The widespread coverage of the event by news crews captured the imagination of the world, and suddenly the Twin Towers were no longer seen as intimidating bland boxes marring the New York skyline, but as skyscrapers with the presence and majesty of the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building, Petit's defiant move opening the floodgates to many more stunts over the ensuing years, including Owen J. Quinn's base jump from the North Tower on July 22, 1975, George Willig's 3-hour climb up the South Tower on May 26, 1977, and Dan Goodwin's scaling of the North Tower on May 30, 1983. As for the World Trade Center's operations, the site struggled to garner a significant number of tenants in order to recoup its costs, a mixture of the American economy still reeling in the wake of the 1973 recession and the incredible amount of floor space available, meaning it wouldn't be until the 1980s that occupancy levels truly began to pick up. But even at its peak, the highest occupation of the World Trade Center at one time was estimated to be around 75%. In 1975, the World Trade Center was allowed a new form of income through the opening of the Top of the World observation deck on the South Tower, a viewing platform that consisted of two parts, an indoor observatory on the 107th floor, which included cafes, small eateries, souvenir shops, a model of Lower Manhattan, and a 40-seat cinema that presented a 6-minute virtual helicopter tour across New York City, and an open-air viewing deck elevated 15 feet above the roof of the tower, which was accessed by 2 escalators. The rooftop observation deck allowing for an unobstructed 360-degree view across the tri-state area, capable of seeing distances of up to 50 miles on a good day, thereby making it one of the biggest tourist hubs in the city, often seeing up to 2 million visitors pass through its doors per year. Across the way from the South Tower's observation deck was the Windows on the World restaurant, a high-class eatery that had been established in the North Tower on both the 106th and 107th floors, this being the brainchild of restaurateur Joe Baum, who, at a cost of around $17 million, opened the restaurant in April 1976 and comprised 3 separate eateries, the Windows restaurant itself, the Wild Blue, and the Greatest Bar on Earth. The Windows on the World was among the most prestigious restaurants on Earth, which enforced a strict black-tie dress code, and with a peak revenue of $37 million per year, it was also the highest-grossing restaurant in the United States, while the adjacent Wild Blue restaurant was a touch more low-key and was mainly for use by tourists, these 2 eateries complemented by the Greatest Bar on Earth, which, within its vast wine cellar known as the Cellar in the Sky, stocked up to 50,000 bottles of more than 1,500 selections, including Bordeaux, Burgundies, and dessert wines, many of which were the first bottles of the season to be output by some of the finest and most notable vineyards in the world, with prices that rose to an astronomical $250 to $500 per bottle. In 1978, the first major modification to the Twin Towers came through the fitting of a 362-foot television antenna to the roof of the North Tower, utilizing the Hat Truss architectural system to distribute the weight of the mass throughout the structure, and would go on to host a majority of New York's radio, TV, and communications services, while in 1981, the World Trade Center was expanded through the addition of the last original building outlined in Yamasaki's concept, the 22-story Vista International Hotel, which was nestled between the 2 towers and West Street, this building being designed by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and accommodated 825 luxury suites, several restaurants, a top-floor gym that spanned the entire length of the building, with an Olympic-sized swimming pool and elevated running track, 26,000 square feet of meeting space across the entire 3rd floor, and the New Amsterdam Ballroom on the main floor. Finally, in 1987, the last structure of the World Trade Center to be built was completed, that being 7 World Trade Center, a 47-story office building located on the opposite side of Vesey Street from the main complex, this building designed by Emery Roth & Sons, and was 610 feet tall, occupying a trapezoidal footprint that was 330 feet long and 140 feet wide, the building's facade clad in red granite, which appeared more brown from a distance. As 2 of America's tallest buildings, and as an instantly recognizable part of New York's skyline, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center had cemented their place in U.S. culture due to their size and their iconic nature, finding their way into hundreds of films, thousands of pictures, and countless other forms of media, either dedicated to the towers themselves or just incidentally caught in the background of this vibrant city. However, what's one nation's pride is another's scorn, and the fame the Twin Towers garnered came at a heavy price, their image as a symbol of New York, America, and the capitalist way, making them a target for those wishing to destroy such iconography, the first attempt coming on February 26, 1993, when a Ryder truck carrying 1,300 pounds of explosive was detonated in the underground car park below the North Tower, killing 6 people and injuring over 1,000. The attack was carried out by members of an Islamic terrorist organization called Al-Qaeda, and was directly perpetrated by 2 men, Ramzi Youssef and Ayad Ismail, with Youssef, who had been training with Al-Qaeda since 1991, having planned an attack on the United States due to the country's support of Israel against Palestine, with funding and advice for the bombing being provided by his uncle, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who paid him and his co-conspirator, Mohammed Salameh, with a $660 wire transfer. Illegally entering the United States in September 1992, Youssef began preparing his attack, assisted by the congregation of the Al-Farouq Mosque in Brooklyn, which was led by the controversial blind Muslim cleric Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, also known as the Blind Sheikh, Rahman having made a name for himself in U.S. society for his vocal disdain of the American people, while issuing a fatwa that allowed, under Islamic law, his followers to rob banks and murder Jews, putting him on a surveillance list with the FBI. Setting up in Jersey City, New Jersey, his apartment providing direct views of the World Trade Center, Youssef assembled his 1,500-pound urea nitrate hydrogen gas-enhanced bomb, as well as visiting the Twin Towers to scope out a place to detonate the device, finally settling on the underground parking garage at an area beneath the southeast corner of the North Tower, his plan being to destroy the support columns holding that side of the tower up, causing it to topple over and collapse onto its twin, bringing both towers down, the hope being that in the midday attack, with occupancy of the 2 buildings by both tourists and workers being near enough at their peak, upward of 250,000 people would be killed. Finally, on Friday, February 26, 1993, Youssef and Ismail drove a yellow Ryder van into Lower Manhattan and parked it in the B2 level parking lot of the World Trade Center beneath the North Tower's southeast corner, lighting a 20-foot fuse before the pair fled on foot, the bomb detonating approximately 15 minutes later at 12:17 p.m., sending a blast that ripped through 4 levels of the center's underground parking lot, blowing a hole in the plaza floor at the base of the North Tower, and collapsing a portion of the roof inside the underground PATH station, while power to the entire complex was knocked out as the pipe used to pump water from the Hudson River to feed the tower's air conditioning system was broken, flooding the generator room, causing all elevators to stop, and in so doing trapping hundreds inside elevator cars within both towers, the trapped including 17 kindergartners who were on their way down from the South Tower's observation deck when they became stuck between the 35th and 36th floors until they were rescued by firefighters. In the carnage of the explosion, 6 people were killed, 4 of whom were Port Authority employees having lunch in a sub-level office not far from the parked van, and 1 being an assistant chef at the windows on the World restaurant awaiting a delivery, while 1 month after the blast, the body of businessman John DiGiovanni was eventually recovered, rounding out the death toll for the bombing. Together with the 6 dead, an additional 1,042 people were injured, some initially when parts of the PATH station's roof collapsed, and the remainder due to smoke inhalation or during the chaotic evacuation of the towers, the near 50,000 occupants of the buildings having to file down the 3 blackened stairwells in order to escape the 2 110-story chimneys with little to no direction provided, many choosing instead to smash windows to vent the smoke and await rescue, while, against regulations, the NYPD undertook helicopter rescue missions from the roofs of each tower, evacuating a total of 28 people, most of whom either had medical conditions or were pregnant. Evacuation of the World Trade Center took nearly 9 hours to complete, and by nightfall the Twin Towers remained powerless, though the insistence of New York's mayor, David Dinkins, saw lighting returned as soon as possible in order to avoid the image of the blackened-out World Trade Center marking the skyline, all while Ramzi Yousef made his escape, leaving America on a flight to Iraq only 4 hours after the bombing, his attack having only damaged the underground parking areas, but could have potentially succeeded if the van had been parked closer to the North Tower's poured concrete foundations. The attack on the World Trade Center was one that shocked America, as it was the first time the nation had suffered a terrorist bombing from a foreign perpetrator that didn't constitute an act of war, as per the attack on Pearl Harbor, and while wreckage of the van, including its VIN number, was used to trace it back to the Ryder dealership from where Mohammed Salameh had hired it, leading to his arrest when he returned to the dealership to claim his van had been stolen, an FBI investigation was able to link the attack to the blind Sheikh Abdel Rahman, who was arrested on June 24, 1993, and subsequently convicted of seditious conspiracy, solicitation to murder Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, conspiracy to murder President Mubarak, solicitation to attack a U.S. military installation, and conspiracy to conduct bombings, resulting in a sentence of life in solitary confinement without parole at the FMC Rochester Maximum Security Prison in Minnesota in 1996, where he died in February 2017. Ramzi Yousef himself was apprehended in Islamabad, Pakistan on February 7, 1995, after a tip-off by associate Istaq Parker, the subsequent confiscation of his belongings indicating that he was planning several large-scale attacks on America and its civilians through what was known as the Boshinka Plot, which called for the placement of bombs aboard 11 flights operated by U.S. airlines between East Asia and the United States while over the Pacific Ocean, the proposed assassination of Pope John Paul II during his visit to the Philippines in January 1995 with a suicide bomber dressed as a priest, and the hijacking of multiple airliners that would have been crashed into U.S. skyscrapers and landmarks, including the White House, the Pentagon, the Sears Tower in Chicago, the Transamerica Pyramid in San Francisco, the Empire State Building, and the World Trade Center, with Yousef going on trial in New York, and in 1996 being sentenced to life imprisonment, plus an additional 240 years for both the bombing of the Twin Towers and Philippine Airlines Flight 434, his entire sentence to be served in solitary confinement. Back at the World Trade Center, a massive effort was undertaken by the Port Authority to rebuild the extensive damage to the complex, including the repair of broken glass, clearing away the soot and grime from the smoke, and to fix the plaza area and parking levels, resulting in the South Tower reopening for business only 20 days after the bombing, followed a week later by the North Tower, among the first occupants to return to their offices being the Port Authority. Elsewhere in the World Trade Center, up to $700 million of renovations were undertaken to make sure that, in the event of another attack, the Twin Towers and its surrounding complex would be better suited to a full-scale evacuation, as well as mitigating the possibility of an attack overall, with glow-in-the-dark paint and strips being introduced in the stairwells to make sure that people could descend the tower in the event of a power loss, and evacuation procedures being updated, with floor fire marshals now provided high-visibility jackets, marked baseball caps for identification, and torches. Perhaps the biggest change was the creation of the New York Office of Emergency Management, or OEM, on the 23rd floor of World Trade Center 7. This project being approved by then newly elected Mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, and saw the creation of a bunker inside Building 7 that, in the event of a major disaster or crisis, would allow the city government the ability to maintain management and control, the office including the installation of several emergency generators that were fed by 24,000-gallon diesel fuel tanks located underground. Finally, in an effort of closure to the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, a small memorial was created on the plaza level above where the bombing took place, adjacent to the North Tower. This memorial, designed by Ellen Zimmerman, being a simple piece comprising an 18-foot diameter, 3.5-foot high circular fountain trimmed with black granite onto which the names of the victims were inscribed, this fountain having been constructed in late 1994 before it was unveiled in a small ceremony on February 26, 1995, the second anniversary of the attack. With this, the World Trade Center could look to the future in prosperity, and in 1997, the World Trade Center's plaza, named the Austin J. Tobin Plaza in 1978 following the former Port Authority director's death, underwent a massive 18-month renovation to iron out many of the lingering faults that accompanied such a large open space. The changes to the plaza including the addition of food kiosks, espresso bars, and sandwich restaurants with outdoor tables and chairs, clay-colored benches, additional lighting, ambient speakers through which music was played, and the fixing of the rotation device under Fritz Koenig's Sphere after it had spent nearly a decade out of commission. During the latter half of the decade, the World Trade Center became notable for being the site of the Bank of America robbery on January 14, 1998, when actor and petty criminal Ralph Guarino, who had received inside information from World Trade Center employee Salvatore Calciano about the arrival time of the Bank of America's armored bank truck delivering money to their offices on the 11th floor of the North Tower, ambushed the bank workers and stole $1.6 million, or $2.5 million in 2021. But despite the audacity of the crime, the robbers didn't maintain their freedom for long, and within 2 days the entire gang had been arrested, with most of the money being found at Guarino's home in Staten Island, the latter becoming an FBI informant on the DeCavalcante mafia family to avoid jail time, while as of 2021, the World Trade Center robbery is listed as the 7th largest robbery in United States history. In the wake of the Black Monday crash of October 1987, as fewer tenants occupied office space in New York due to the prolonged recovery of the American economy, the Port Authority found it was difficult to justify the corporate tax burdens applied to occupants of the World Trade Center as per their original agreement with City Hall back in the 1960s, and therefore opted to privatize the complex in 1998, followed in 2001 by an offer to lease the site to private entities, the Vornado Realty Trust being announced to have won the $3.25 billion 99-year lease on February 15, 2001, but quickly lost following a last-minute desire by Vornado to change the deal and shorten the lease to 39 years, the Port Authority considering this non-negotiable and forcing Vornado to withdraw. The rival offer from Silverstein Properties winning the bid by default on April 26th, the deal being formally closed at a ceremony within the World Trade Center's plaza on July 24, 2001. The summer of 2001 was by far the World Trade Center's Renaissance year, the Twin Towers having now been considered a staple of New York as they enjoyed their place in dozens of movies during that year alone, while the plaza echoed to the sound of summer-long musical and dance events at the center stage venue, with long-term plans for the future of the site being a renovation of the South Tower's observation deck during the winter of 2001 to update it for the 2002 summer season, while proposals had also been made by Westfield to fully refurbish both the mall and PATH station, set for completion by the end of 2003. Sadly, all these optimistic plans for the World Trade Center came to a sudden and tragic end on a sunny morning in September, as unbeknownst to the people of New York, evil forces had once again conspired to topple the city's mightiest skyscrapers, and few could have imagined that the towers, as well as 2,977 innocent lives, were witnessing their last dawn.
No, I don't stop. The gas mains right here. Right down.
Whatever has occurred has just occurred within minutes, and we are trying to determine exactly what
This just in, you were looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center.
See the pieces falling, Mike?
Kind of an effort up there yet. Now remember, oh my God.
My God. That looks like a second plane.
No idea right
oh,
now.
There's another one. Another plane just hit. Right. Oh my God. Another plane has just hit. It hit another building. Flew right into the middle of it. Explosion. My God. It's right in the middle of the building.
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the two towers. A huge explosion now raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way.
It may be that something has fallen. We don't know, to be perfectly honest, but that is what you're looking at, is the current. That's the scene at this moment at the World Trade Center. Dan Daler from ABC's Good Morning America is down in the general vicinity. Dan, can you tell us what has just happened?
Yes, Peter, it's Don Daler down here. I'm 4 blocks north of the World Trade Center. The second building that was hit by the plane has just completely collapsed. The entire building has just collapsed, as if a demolition team set off. When you see the old demolitions of these old buildings, it folded down on itself, and it is not there anymore.
The South Tower of the World Trade Center just minutes ago collapsed to the ground. Only one tower is standing at this point.
I have a direct line of sight to what is left of the World Trade Center. The fire continues to burn. I can see the flames through the thick smoke.
Jimmy, the second tower just went.
Good Lord. There are no words.
The attacks of September 11, 2001 have been documented with great detail in countless films, books, and other forms of media, not only because this one terrorist act completely upturned the fabric of Western society, but also brought crashing into the consciousness of regular civilians everywhere the concept of how vulnerable the innocent actually were to a coordinated insurgent strike. While the 1993 bombing had largely been forgotten, 9/11 was an event that touched the lives of nearly everyone on a deep and personal level, not just those living in New York, but for thousands across the globe, as 372 people of 62 nationalities were also victims of the Twin Towers destruction, a sign of the global significance the World Trade Center had, as per its namesake, but also of how the attack was one that had far-reaching effects to the furthest corners of the Earth. Starting at 08:46 a.m., as Manhattan basked in the crisp warm glow of that September morning, the peace was shattered by the sound of hijacked American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767, en route from Boston to Los Angeles, as it roared down the Hudson shore and slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center between the 93rd and 99th floors, the 140-ton aircraft killing hundreds instantly and severing all escape routes for the approximately 1,344 people trapped above. As pollutant black smoke filled the sky, news stations across the globe focused in on the burning skyscraper, perfectly positioned to witness the final moments of United Airlines Flight 175, another Boeing 767, also en route from Boston to Los Angeles, as it swept in low across the Statue of Liberty and the Upper Harbor before ramming the South Tower between the 78th and 82nd floors. In Washington, D.C., the nation's capital came directly under fire as American Airlines Flight 77, a Boeing 757 flying from Washington to Los Angeles, flew in over the Potomac and crashed into the western wall of the Pentagon, the heart of America's military command, while over rural Pennsylvania, upon hearing from loved ones about the attacks on New York and Washington, passengers aboard the hijacked United Airlines Flight 93, another Boeing 757 on a flight from Newark to San Francisco, bravely staged a daring attempt to regain control of the plane, only for the hijackers to deliberately crash the airliner into a field near Shanksville rather than surrender control, killing all on board, the potential target of the doomed flight being either the U.S. Capitol building or the White House. Then, as civilians evacuated and emergency responders converged on the burning Twin Towers to save as many as they could, the unthinkable occurred when the South Tower, after burning for a mere 56 minutes, crumbled to dust before the eyes of the world, the 110-story structure taking its final plunge in the space of only 10 seconds, followed half an hour later by the terrifying 8-second collapse of its twin, the destruction of the World Trade Center, leaving a devastating pile of twisted metal and carnage in its wake, while lower Manhattan was left blanketed in a thick curtain of toxic dust filled with asbestos, leading to prolonged health conditions, including cancer, that would continue to claim victims for the next decade, before finally, at around 5:30 that evening, the 47-story World Trade Center 7, which had been severely damaged by the collapse of the North Tower, imploded, the final building of the World Trade Center to collapse that day, and bringing an end to the worst terrorist incident of modern history. While it's often been disputed as to why the World Trade Center fell, many considering that these structures were poorly built and that their lightweight construction made them vulnerable, the reality is that the Twin Towers not only met their design parameters, but surpassed them, the buildings having never been designed to stand indefinitely under such circumstances, but to remain standing long enough to allow the evacuation of as many of the building's tenants as possible. In the context of the 9/11 attacks, the Twin Towers had only been built to sustain the impact of a Boeing 707 airliner flying at low speed while in the approach pattern to one of the airports, not a deliberate attack, wherein much larger Boeing 767s were used as missiles against the buildings, and in that, their sturdy construction allowed them to stand for as long as they did, while other skyscrapers of similar size would have either collapsed immediately or within a time span that wouldn't have allowed for the evacuation of 25,000 people, as did the World Trade Center. In the end, the lightweight tube-based structure was both the savior and the Achilles heel of the World Trade Center towers, as while it was able to survive the initial impact of the airliners by redistributing the load of the building to the undamaged perimeter columns, the loss of so many structural elements, combined with the subsequent office fire that ravaged the exposed metalwork of the interior, meant the Twin Towers were doomed to inevitable collapse, taking with them 2,192 civilians, 343 firefighters, and 71 policemen, among others. However, despite September 11th being among the darkest days in human history, this devastating act of evil was punctuated by widespread acts of heroism and sacrifice that saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives, one example being Morgan Stanley Security Director Cyril Rick Rescorla, a native of Hale in Cornwall, who had fought for the British Army in Rhodesia and the US Army in Vietnam, and had correctly predicted both attacks on the World Trade Center due to its symbolic nature and vulnerable security arrangements, his demands for rigorous evacuation training among his fellow colleagues in the wake of the 1993 bombing, helping to save 2,687 Morgan Stanley employees, motivating them over the bullhorn by singing a Cornish variation of the traditional Welsh marching song Men of Harlech, before tragically becoming a victim of the disaster when the skyscraper he'd sworn to protect came crashing down around him, Rescorla last being sighted on the 10th floor of the building, heading upwards to try and save as many as he could. Elsewhere in the South Tower, Brian Clark, a businessman at Eurobank, ventured into the devastated 81st floor of the building after hearing the cries of Stanley Pramath, a Fuji Bank executive who had been trapped when his office took the direct impact of United 175, Clark freeing Pramath before leading him down the only stairwell that had been left unobstructed by the attack, one of only 18 people known to have done so, before the tower fell, both men escaping to safety just minutes before the building's collapse. In the North Tower, Port Authority architect Frank DeMartini led colleagues Pablo Ortiz, Peter Negron, Carlos da Costa, and Mac Hanna from their offices on the 88th floor up to the severely damaged 89th floor in order to save those who had somehow survived the devastating impact of American Airlines Flight 11, rescuing dozens who had become trapped when parts of the floor had collapsed on them during the crash, and trying to save as many as possible before all but Hanna were lost when the building crumbled. Elsewhere, ladder companies and firehouses across the city who had responded to the attacks took heavy casualties. Ladder 118 of Brooklyn, whose final dash to the World Trade Center was immortalized by photographer Aaron McLam, losing all 6 of their team, while Brooklyn's Squad 1, whose fire engine had become trapped in rush-hour traffic in the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, ran the remainder of their journey to the Twin Towers, their dedication to duty captured by Stephen Floth from his car as firefighter Gary Box led the charge, only for he and 12 members of his team to die during the attacks. The worst-hit firehouse was Engine 54 Ladder 4 Battalion 9 in Midtown, who lost 15 members of their team on 9/11, the only one to have an entire shift killed that day, while the wider FDNY lost 4 of its highest-ranking members, Fire Chief Peter J. Yancey Jr., Commissioner William M. Feehan, Marshal Ronald Paul Booker, and Chaplain Michael Judge, who was administering the last rites to the dying in the lobby of the North Tower when the South Tower collapsed, Judge being killed as debris exploded across the room, his death being the first certified fatality of the September 11, 2001 attacks. In the wake of 9/11, as the world declared outright war on terrorism, and the comparative peace of the optimistic 1990s was shattered through multiple conflicts in the Middle East and the rise of fundamentalist insurgent groups, the smoldering ruins of the World Trade Center left a gaping hole in lower Manhattan, a skyline now disfigured beyond recognition as the sun set on a New York without the Twin Towers that had graced the horizon only 24 hours earlier. Once recovery efforts were completed in the immediate aftermath of the attacks, the remains of the World Trade Center were torn down gradually throughout late 2001 and into 2002, the last skeletal exterior columns of the Twin Towers themselves being removed on December 15th, while the final above-ground structure, the burned-out husk that was once World Trade Center 6, was pulled down in May 2002, leaving the site an empty hole reaching down to bedrock. For years following, debate as to what should replace the World Trade Center continued without progress, with early surveys conducted by the New York Times showing that 80% of citizens demanded a newer, stronger pair of twin towers that should rise from the ashes of the previous ones, enthusiasm for this concept spurred on by the Twin Towers 2 project developed by Team Twin Towers Inc., which proposed a new pair of 115-story buildings designed externally to resemble the originals, but would be fundamentally reworked internally to include the latest fire safety and construction methods in order to secure their future, this scheme being sponsored by business magnate and later US President Donald Trump. In the end, market forces prevailed, and after nearly a decade of discussion and planning, a new World Trade Center layout was considered instead, whereby the complex would comprise multiple skyscrapers of heights greater than 50 floors, clad with glass facades, the pinnacle of this project being the 1,776-foot One World Trade Center that stands atop what was formerly World Trade Center 6, while the footprints of the original Twin Towers were preserved as 2 fountain memorials onto which the names of the 2,977 victims have been inscribed, an eternal reminder both to the human and architectural cost of that devastating September morning back in 2001. For One World Trade Center, this structure holds the mantle of tallest building in both New York and the Western Hemisphere, while the other buildings of the new site include buildings 2, 3, 4, and 5, a series of 70 to 80-story towers, a transportation hub which includes a new Westfield shopping mall, a performing arts center, and a rebuilt World Trade Center 7, which was the first of the new buildings to open in 2006, while across Liberty Street lies Liberty Park, an elevated public park adjacent to what was once the South Tower, and from 2017 became the new home of Fritz Koenig's Sphere, which had survived the collapse of the Twin Towers relatively unscathed, and had spent over a decade in a temporary location in Battery Park before being returned to its rightful home at the World Trade Center. The focal point of the site, however, is One World Trade Center, and while many lament that the Twin Towers will never grace the skyline of Manhattan again, the new tower is still an architectural gem, and takes its place among the legacy of New York's long record of skyscrapers, the early criticism of its construction having largely disappeared in the same manner as those who had once maligned the Twin Towers, now comfortably occupying its place as the city's tallest building, and continuing the heritage of its forebears as the symbolic face of the capitalist system, even down to its equally iconic name, the World Trade Center.